All right, Matt, take it away.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight, for braving the wall of humidity that confronted you, sucker punched you in the gut, you might even say. So thank you all for coming out here tonight. So tonight's program is somewhat based on the research I did for my article on the Red Sox in the Bicentennial book, but it's also a much bigger expansion of that research. And in researching the Red Sox, one thing that really struck out to me was the sense of community that revolved around the team during its existence. Most of these players were local players. They may have played professionally for a time, but they mostly played semi-pro baseball. So everyone kind of had a strong community bond to these players. So I want to hit on that community aspect tonight. I also want to talk about just the general history of the team from 1935 to 1952. I want to talk about some notable games, which is something I was not able to do a whole lot of in the Bicentennial book. And then, like I said, I also just wanted to highlight some of those strong community connections. Now, I'm also going to be talking a lot about specific players who played for the Red Sox. And I didn't choose these players based on any kind of like statistical achievement, you know, who had the most home runs for the Red Sox, nothing like that. It's mostly just players who I thought their stories were most interesting, although one of them is really blatantly obvious when you find out where he went to college at. Hint, hint. So, early days, the team was formed in 1935. It was semi-pro. So what did that mean? Semi-pro meant that all the players were paid to play, but they weren't paid enough to make a full living on. So they all worked full-time jobs elsewhere, and then they would play baseball with the Red Sox on the side, usually 2 to 3 days per week. They would make about $100 per game. So decent money, but certainly not enough to make a full living on. This was the third team that was named the Red Sox. The first two existed from about 1914 to the early 1920s, and they played down at League Park, which was on the levee, which is about where the Hampton Inn Hotel is now. Aside from the name, that's the only connection that the Red Sox I'm talking about have with the old Red Sox of the 19-teens. They shared the same name. There were 4 different Red Sox teams. None of them are related in any kind of way. For whatever reason, Lafayette just really loved the name Red Sox. And they were coached by John Rosser. John Rosser managed the team for all but 1 year of the team's existence, except for 1946 when he was ill. And he was a rural postal clerk in Battleground, and he played baseball with a lot of local teams and managed them. We were going through the scorebook over here on the table earlier, and there's a game between the Schwab Company and Battleground, and I believe Rosser is in that scorebook playing for Battleground. So it shows that he played baseball in the area for a very long time, and he managed the team for a very long time. The team was also founded by other figures here in Lafayette, including Gordon Graham, who was a longtime sports columnist for the Journal and Courier. He was there for about 40 years before he passed away in the 1960s. Graham wrote a regular column in the Journal and Courier called Graham Crackers. Get it? And Graham Crackers usually appeared about 4 to 5 times a week in the paper. And it's because he was sort of a central figure in the founding of the Red Sox and he wrote so many columns, we were just presented with just an amazing collection of columns documenting the history of the team from its existence to when it disbanded. Others in the ownership group included Charles Sarge Biltz, who was a police officer, and then of course the restaurant that was named after him, Graham, and then Henry Ebershoff, who was the owner of Lafayette Tent and Awning. So it was a very local conglomeration of people who came together to found the team. And they ran the team more like a nonprofit, meaning that it wasn't run as like an investment to make them money. It was more meant to be there as a community asset to provide an entertainment source to Lafayette. So who were some of the opponents that the Red Sox played in those early days? So the first game was on May 20th, 1935 against Anderson, which would have been another semi-pro team. That's Anderson, Indiana. And Lafayette beat Anderson 7-0. The Red Sox were part of a semi-pro league called the Indiana-Ohio League, also known as the IO League. And like I said earlier, they typically played 2, maybe 3 games a week, usually on Wednesdays and Sundays is when they would play. And the IO League is interesting in that in the late 30s, it was briefly integrated racially, meaning that there were black teams in the league. So there were 2 teams in Ohio, one in Cincinnati and one in Dayton. And then there was an iteration of the Indianapolis ABCs that was in the league briefly as well. The ABCs are one of the charter members of the Negro Leagues, and so one of the more famous Negro League teams out there. Early on, the Red Sox mostly consisted of amateur players, different people from around the community who had different jobs. So the first two, Charlie Dienhart and Raymond Poot Bossing, were West Lafayette firemen. Dienhart played for a few years and then left the team because he became chief of the West Lafayette Fire Department. So it's kind of hard to balance a baseball career and be chief of the fire department all at the same time, as I'm sure we all know. Bossing is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, he actually wasn't on the team for very long because he got in an argument with Rosser and left the team. Not entirely sure what the argument was about, but apparently it was big enough for him to leave the team. It's also interesting because on my mom's side, he is a great, great uncle. So I thought it was kind of cool that I have a relationship to the Red Sox. And then Jack Porter, who worked at Alcoa, he was later assistant manager under Rosser. I think I missed part two. So the Red Sox, in the late 30s, they played on the site of where Loeb Stadium is now at the corner of Main and Wallace Streets there at Columbian Park. However, at the time, there was no official stadium there. It was just basically a lot, a sand lot that was unfenced with just some basic bleachers there for seats. And Rosser had to pay, using his own money, to put up a canvas fence around the lot so they could actually charge admission to the games. So then moving on into the 1940s, which I consider to sort of be the peak years of the Red Sox. So starting right off the bat in 1940, we get a new stadium on the site at Loeb Stadium, donated by Bert Loeb, who owned Loeb's department store. He donated the money to build the stadium. It was made of concrete and steel, and it featured lights for night games, which at the time was a novel feature. It featured a PA system, which was also novel, and Gordon Graham usually did PA duty in addition to covering the game for the Journal and Courier. And it had a capacity of just over 3,000 people. More famously, later on, after the Red Sox disbanded, it became home of the Colt World Series, which was the tournament for 15 and 16-year-old baseball teams from across the world. They'd come to Lafayette. That started in 1969 and then lasted up until 2016 or 17. I can't remember offhand. So a lot of future major leaguers came to the Colt World Series and played here in Lafayette before they went on to become major league players. One thing I always love is when I listen to Chicago Cubs games, both of the Cubs broadcasters were in the Colt World Series, not at the same time, but every now and then they'll talk about when they played in the Colt World Series with each other. And so I just think that's really cool. And Loeb was eventually demolished in 2019 and then replaced with the current Loeb Stadium that we have now at Columbian Park. So now that we get into the 40s, we start to see the Red Sox starting to, they start to expand their variety of opponents. It was still playing a lot of semi-pro teams, but then also we started to see major league teams coming into Loeb Stadium. So one of the first ones was the Philadelphia Athletics, who you would probably know more as the Oakland Athletics, who are now stuck in some limbo between Oakland and Las Vegas. And that game was in 1940, and the Red Sox won 6-5. The Athletics, the reason why they came here was because they were on their way from playing in Washington, D.C. to going to St. Louis. So Lafayette was kind of a stopover for a lot of major league teams. They could play an exhibition game, earn a little extra money on the side, and give fans in Lafayette a chance to see major leaguers. So it was a win-win for everybody when you think of it that way. So continued with the IO League, and then more importantly, in 1941, we had the first Negro League exhibition here at Loeb Stadium against the Red Sox. And this was against the Kansas City Monarchs, who featured Satchel Paige. Paige pitched for something like 25 years, maybe close to 30, depending on who you ask. Pitched in over 2,000 games. Again, depends on who you ask, because Negro League records are sketchy, so there's a chance he probably pitched in more games than we'll ever know, for that matter. Monarchs won that game 7-2. Paige pitched 3 innings, I believe had 3 strikeouts and a hit. If you really want to know more about that particular game, I did a program on black baseball here in Lafayette a couple years ago where I talked about this particular game. Gordon Grant did not have the greatest reaction to seeing Satchel Paige at the time. But I think a lot of that was because at the time Paige was injured, which no one really knew about. And because of that, people who watched him play didn't think he was actually trying hard enough, when in reality, he was having arm troubles and trying to get through those. So if you want more in-depth examination of that, I highly recommend looking at that program. So the Negro League exhibitions they're probably the most fascinating part of the Red Sox history, at least to me. Like I said, first exhibition was here in Lafayette in 1941 against the Monarchs. Exhibitions were held to bring in extra revenue, not just for the Red Sox, but also for the Negro League teams, because these teams were just traveling constantly throughout the season, very few days off, and they didn't necessarily have their own stadiums, so they were just always on the road traveling and making money. And because of that, especially with Lafayette being between Chicago and Indy, which were two Negro League powerhouses, it was a perfect stopover for a lot of teams to come here and play an extra game on the side before they would go to those cities to play league games. More importantly, though, what are their importance for Lafayette? So Negro League stats are now part of the Major League Baseball record book. This happened in 2021. Yeah, it was 2021 when Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred announced that that Negro League statistics would be incorporated into the record book, and the Negro Leagues would now be officially recognized as a major league. So Negro League teams from 1920 to 1948 are now considered major league. And the reason why that particular window is because those are the years when the Negro Leagues were at their most stable. Exhibitions are important also because they broke racial barriers in smaller communities. In a community like Lafayette that had a much smaller Black population compared to, say, Indianapolis or Chicago, bringing these Black teams showed the quality of play that they had, and it showed that they were major league caliber teams. And so it kind of broke those racial stereotypes that people may have had against African Americans. However, even though Negro League statistics are not part of the record book, semi-pro exhibitions, like the ones the Red Sox played, are excluded from the historical record. And that creates a problem. So Negro League statistics are compiled on retrosheet.org, which compiles box scores for every Major League Baseball game from 1910 up to the present day. And it includes Negro League scores from 1935 to 1949, again, excluding the semi-pro exhibitions. So what this means is that when you look here at this game log for the 1945 Kansas City Monarchs, where the yellow highlight is, that's a game that's missing from the record book because that game was played in Lafayette. Meaning that Monarchs on the 10th of July played in Indianapolis against the Birmingham Black Barons. On the 11th, they played the Red Sox here in Lafayette. And then on the 12th, they were in Dayton, Ohio, once again playing Birmingham. So for one thing, you get a sense of how exhaustive Negro League travel schedules were. Indianapolis to Dayton via Lafayette does not sound enticing at all. And you also get to see it just adds more games to the record book that we now have. So if you were to look at this, you would just assume, oh, they must have had the 11th off that day. No, they were actually playing in a game that day. It's just not reported in the official record book. If you look below that, you see from the 12th to the 22nd, that's entirely empty. And I would not be surprised if there are more exhibitions missing because they went from Dayton to Detroit. So it's possible they probably played exhibitions in between those two cities. They're just not reported here on retrosheet.org. So you get to see why these exhibitions are important because they fill the historical record with missing Negro League games. Because we have all these records for the white major leagues, but the Negro Leagues, the records are much more sketchy. So filling it in with semi-pro exhibitions helps to fill out that record. Overall, the Red Sox from 1941 to 1952. So from 41 to 52, the Red Sox played 38 exhibitions against Negro League teams and then one against a Negro League All-Star team. Should I stop or should I continue? Okay. In those 38 games, the Red Sox went 22-15 against the teams and then 1-0 against the All-Star team. So it was an above 500 record against professional Major League Baseball teams, essentially, which is pretty remarkable when you think about who the players were and like sort of what their backgrounds were.
Online participants are.
Oh, okay. Oh. Sure. Yep. Okay. Sorry about that. So again, altogether, the Red Sox went 23-15 against Negro League baseball teams. So a semi-pro team consisting of players who did not play on a regular basis had a winning record against teams that are now considered major league caliber, which is pretty impressive when you think about it. Moving on from the Negro League exhibitions, naturally 1940s also mean World War II. Now, of course, the war had major implications for Major League Baseball. And what this meant was that starting in 1942 and going through the 45 season, teams were limited to where they could hold spring training. So it was decreed that they could not go farther west than the Mississippi, except for St. Louis, for the St. Louis teams, because those were the farthest west at the time. And then they could not go farther south than the Ohio River / Mason-Dixon line. So what did this mean for Indiana? Well, it means that this was just a buffet of baseball, as I like to call it. This is my favorite period of baseball history. Because when you look at it, Indiana hosted 7 different major league teams and then also some minor league teams as well. So Lafayette hosted the Cleveland Indians, Muncie hosted the Pittsburgh Pirates, the Cincinnati Reds were in Bloomington, the Cubs were in French Lick, Tigers in Evansville, the White Sox were in Terre Haute. A lot of times these teams would use college facilities as part of their training. So the Indians would use Lambert Fieldhouse as part of their training, and then they'd come over to Loeb Stadium to play exhibitions against the Red Sox. So Lafayette became sort of a little hotbed for baseball because you had the major league teams that would come here to Loeb Stadium to play their exhibitions as part of their training. And then you'd also have all the Negro League teams that were coming in to play against the Red Sox, in addition to all the league games that the Red Sox played too. So it was just a lot of different baseball action during the war years. And also, one last thing to note is that, as we all know, Indiana in March and April is just atrocious baseball weather. And so the teams that trained in Indiana became known as either the Limestone League or the Long Underwear League, because it just, again, horrible weather in March and April for baseball. So who were the opponents during the war? Well, the IO League disbanded. So a lot of semi-pro teams, they disbanded because their players were either drafted into the service or they had to go find jobs in war industries. So as I mentioned earlier, there were exhibitions against the Cleveland Indians, but then also we got to see military bases coming to Lafayette to play. So Freeman Field, which was in Seymour, Indiana, Bunker Hill, Chanute Field in Illinois, the Great Lakes Naval Training Station teams, which is just north of Chicago. Great Lakes, because of racial segregation in the military, had both a white team and a black team. The black team debuted here in Lafayette in 1944 on opening day. Lafayette beat them 4-0. The white team came here in August of 44. Lafayette lost 15-4. And Thomas Schoolboy Rowe, who was a pitcher for the Detroit Tigers, he hit a home run that either went 500 feet or went far enough to hit the side of Oakland School across from the park. So it had some energy behind it for sure. Now, with the dwindling of the semi-pro circuits, this meant that more exhibitions against Negro League teams were possible. So now suddenly the Red Sox are playing anywhere from 6 to 8 exhibitions against Negro League teams every season during the war. So now I want to get into some of the first notable players. Like I said, the 40s are really the peak years for the Red Sox. And the first one was Pete Monahan, who is right here at the very side of the picture. Monahan was born in 1902 in Cincinnati, and he debuted at the Red Sox in 1942 as a 40-year-old first baseman. He spent 20 years in professional baseball before coming to the Red Sox. He never made it to the majors. He was only in the minors. He played like for Indianapolis and a bunch of other minor league teams. And he was for the Red Sox all the way through 42 to 52. And during the offseason, he worked at Alcoa, and that's actually how he became associated with the Red Sox, because Poot Bossing recommended him to John Rosser, which suggests that whatever argument Bossing had with Rosser must have not been that big of an argument if he's willing to recommend Monahan to him. So Monahan worked at Alcoa. He was also one of the assistant coaches for the team. Him, Corder, and Rosser were sort of seen as like the three-headed monster, like their brain trust, essentially, of the team on the field. And Monahan, he passed away in 1963. The next player is Mike Kosman. Kosman is interesting for me because I actually discovered him when I was at IU in grad school. I did an exhibit for IU archives on how IU was a training facility during spring training during the war. And I discovered Kosman, and I noticed that he had passed away in Lafayette, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I never really thought more of him again until I started doing research on the Red Sox a couple years ago. So I felt, it's time to bring this story out because it's a pretty cool story, all things considered. So Kosman was born in 1917. He played baseball at IU. I think he graduated with a business degree. And then he debuted with the Red Sox in 1941 after graduation. He was noted as a fast base runner. Supposedly, he was never thrown out at Loeb Stadium when trying to steal a base. I don't know if that's true or not. I've not done the research into that. And then, like Monahan, he also worked at Alcoa and enlisted in the military in 1943, but unfortunately was discharged because of an old injury that he had to his collarbone. So he wasn't in the military for very long. Kosman's biggest claim to fame is that he tried out for the Cincinnati Reds in 1944. He went back down to IU to train with the Reds because he saw an ad in the Sporting News, which at the time was considered the baseball Bible. It was like just a major baseball publication. And teams were so desperate for players by that point that they were posting ads in magazines for players to come down and try out with them. It's truly a different time. So Kosman appeared as a pinch runner for the Reds on April 20th, 1944 against the Cubs. He was thrown out on the next pitch, so he did not get an at-bat, did not get a hit. And that was his only appearance in Major League Baseball. He was released by the Reds as soon as the game ended. So his stat line literally just reads all zeros across the board because of that. In 45, he played minor league ball in Mobile, Alabama, and then he returned to the Red Sox in 1946 and was released in 1947. He later became a banker at First National here in Lafayette. There were a few articles written over the years about his only appearance in Major League Baseball. In one of them, I think it was from the 70s, he said that people still sent him mail asking for autograph requests because they just they would see his name in like encyclopedias saying that he had appeared in only one game, and then they'd want his autograph, and he would sign them because he didn't have a problem with it. He thought it was cool that he played in the majors, so he was happy to sign autographs. And then he passed away in 2002. Now, the next notable player is Dale Davis, probably my personal favorite, and not necessarily because of the college that he attended. Although it's pretty odd. Once I discovered Davis went to Wabash, I knew I had to include him because his story, that just made his story even better as far as I was concerned. So Davis was born in Florida in 1914. He attended Wabash, class of 1936. He played baseball and basketball while at Wabash. After graduating, he coached at Thorntown High School after graduation. And he debuted with the Red Sox, actually. He was one of the early players initially. He debuted with the Red Sox in 1936 as a pitcher. But he left the team shortly thereafter and played for other semi-pro teams in Indiana in 1938 to 1940. He was briefly in the Dodgers minor league system in 1941. Like when I say briefly, maybe 5-6 weeks, if that. Not very long. I'm not entirely sure how he got into the Dodgers system, but he just was there and then he was gone as soon as he came in. And then in the offseason, he became the baseball and basketball coach at Wabash. One particular note is that the 1941-42 Wabash basketball team, they started 1-5 that year, and then they won 15 straight after that. So Davis's coaching numbers are decent, but because he coached during the war, when a lot of students left to go into the service, those numbers are skewed, and so Wabash's records they don't look as good as they probably should have been just because of all the players that were lost due to the war. So Davis re-signed with the Red Sox in 1942. He's right here. And because the Red Sox usually only play 2 days a week, they didn't really need that many starting pitchers. So usually he was one of 2 starting pitchers on the team. The other one was Slim DeLion, who is standing here next to him. Because he pitched in so many different games, Davis faced a lot of different teams, a wide variety, including Negro League teams. Of those 38 Negro League exhibitions that the Red Sox played, Davis appeared in 19 of them. and he had an 8-5 record against the Negro League teams. And so because of that, I like to use Davis to look at all the Negro League games that the Red Sox played. So I selected 4 of them that I thought that had interesting connections to them. So one of them was in 1942 against the Birmingham Black Barons. He faced double duty Radcliffe, who was one of the first, who was a black two-way player. So like we all know Shohei Ohtani, who can both hit and pitch successfully. Radcliffe was one of those kinds of players of his day. So he was kind of like the Shohei Ohtani of the Negro Leagues, if you want to think of it like that. I think I wrote down, I don't know. So the Barons won that game 7-6 in 10 innings. Radcliffe went 3 for 5 with a homer and a triple off of Davis. The next year in 1943, the Kansas City Monarchs once again came to town. Davis had to pitch in relief in that game, so he only pitched 1 inning in the 9th. And one of those players that he faced was Buck O'Neil. So anyone who's seen Ken Burns' baseball knows who Buck O'Neil is. He was one of the great storytellers of Negro League baseball history. And in that game, because he only pitched in that 1 inning, he held O'Neil hitless, so he got the final out of that game. And the Red Sox won that game. The next year in 1944, the Great Lakes Negro League team, which I mentioned earlier, they came to Lafayette. That team was loaded with Negro League stars because those military teams, a lot of them would feature ex-major league players who were drafted into the service. And then those teams would travel across the country as sort of like on bond drives, things like that, sort of build morale on the home front. So both of those teams were stacked, and the Negro League team was definitely one of them. Among those was Larry Doby. And Doby is the second black baseball player to appear in the major leagues. So Jackie Robinson was the first. He appeared for the Dodgers in April of 47. Doby appeared for the Cleveland Indians in like July of 47. So not too long after Robinson. In that game, Davis pitched all 9 innings, full complete game, held him scoreless, 4-0 Red Sox victory. And he held Larry Doby hitless in that game. And then 1945 against the Kansas City Monarchs, once again, my personal favorite Red Sox game, in the game I wrote about in the Bicentennial book. Kansas City Monarchs featuring Jackie Robinson in their lineup. Robinson had been discharged from the military in 1944. So looking for work, he joined the Monarchs for the 1945 season. So the Monarchs came here to Lafayette. Jackie Robinson was highly anticipated. Everyone was looking forward to seeing him because they knew who he was because he had played at UCLA. Now, this was a wild game. 16 innings. Davis pitched all 16 innings. True workhorse, right? 16 strikeouts, 16 hits. Just an absolutely awesome game. This is probably the greatest game that I have found in Red Sox history. Game was tied at 2 after the 6th inning, and it remained scoreless until the top of the 16th when Kansas City broke the tie, and then they won the game 5-2. Robinson went 3 for 5 with 2 triples in that game. Now, one thing that I love about this game, and I want you all to think about it, is this game went 16 innings. The Red Sox were a semi-pro team. Guys worked full-time jobs elsewhere, then played baseball on the side. They held one of the greatest Negro League teams scoreless for 9 full innings in this game. That's the equivalent of an entire Major League like a regulation baseball game. So think about that. All these semi-pros holding Major League teams scoreless for 9 full innings. Even though they lost, it's still a very impressive game, especially when you consider that Davis pitched all 16 innings in that game. So, Mike Kosman, Davis was released by the Red Sox in 1947. They were both released at the same time. He left Wabash that year as well and became an insurance salesman. He was inducted into Wabash's Athletics Hall of Fame in 1988, and then he passed away in 1992. And the last one I want to talk about is Paul Spider Fields, who is right down there. Fields is a local baseball legend, I think it's safe to say. He was born in Lafayette in 1926. He grew up near Columbian Park and so was always going to baseball games at Loeb Stadium. He earned his nickname Spider for the way he caught fly balls. I'm still not entirely sure what that means. I would like to have seen that, but it must have been something for him to get that nickname, is all I can figure. Fields was usually the Red Sox bat boy from like about 1936 up until when he went to the service in 45, but he did play occasionally with the Red Sox, and supposedly he played under an assumed name for one game. So there is a 1975 Journal and Courier article that talks about just the history of the Red Sox, and it mentions in its I think John Rosser was interviewed in that game or in that article, and Rosser says, "Yeah, we've played Spider Fields in a game once, but we played him under a fake name because he was too young to play with us." So that naturally got me curious, and I had to start digging into that. So I found a Graham Crackers column from 1945 where Graham wrote that the game in question occurred in 1944 against Fort Wayne. The problem is that the Red Sox played 5 games against Fort Wayne that year, so then you got to dig even farther for that. I think it was this particular game, July 24th, 1944, against Fort Wayne. Red Sox regular left fielder Joe Dooley was out of the game because he could not make it to the game in time from work. So in his place was Jack Hill, who played left field. Now, Hill is interesting because aside from one other game that I've seen him in a box score, which from like the week before, I've never seen his name again in any box score for the Red Sox. And Jack Hill just seems like one of those kind of like one of those names where it's like, oh, there's a million Jack Hills out there. It's like John Smith, like there's a million of them out there. So it could very well be Jack Hill could have been Spider Fields, or maybe there actually was a Jack Hill who played for a couple games for the Red Sox. But it's certainly intriguing enough to think that is this the game where Fields played under an assumed name. So Fields went to the military in 1945. After being discharged, he graduated from Purdue with both a bachelor's and a master's. He taught at both Sunnyside and Jeff from 1952 to 1986. He coached baseball at Jeff, where he won 2 state titles in baseball. And he and a few other coaches were instrumental in the ISHAA starting a baseball tournament in the 1960s. So he had a big part in that as well. I don't have this written down, but in 2019 at Loeb Stadium's last game, the old Loeb Stadium, he sang the 7th inning stretch. I was actually at that game, but I left early because my back was killing me because the seats at Old Loeb were just very uncomfortable, and I just could not make it. In hindsight, really wish I had made it. After the new Loeb Stadium opened in 2021, Fields threw out the first pitch. If you go to Loeb Stadium now, the entryway plaza up above, it says Paul Spider Fields entryway. So be on the lookout anytime you go to Loeb Stadium in the near future.
Paul and Amy.
And he passed away just recently in 2022 at the age of 96. So he lived a very long and fruitful life. So as we get later into the 1940s and into the early 1950s, we start to see things changing for the Red Sox. There was a changing landscape. The IO League did not come back together after the war. Instead, it was the Indiana-Michigan League that was established, naturally featuring teams in Indiana and Michigan. Negro League exhibitions start to diminish after 1947 because once Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, all these black players were starting to be poached from the Negro League teams by the white teams. And because they weren't being paid for their players, they were losing revenue and they were losing their star attractions. And so the teams had to fold. So because of that, we start to see those Negro League teams, they start to diminish with their appearances here in Lafayette. One notable thing I did discover, I don't know how frequent this was, but I did find a few mentions of it in the Journal and Courier, is that games were occasionally broadcast on WASK, which, that's pretty major for the time. I don't know who was doing the play-by-play. I wouldn't be surprised if Gordon Graham had a part to do with that because he was involved in just about every other aspect of the team that you can think of. But I just thought that was interesting that they were actually starting to be broadcast on the radio in their last years. So unfortunately, in the 40s, the crowd starts to diminish. What used to be 3,000 seat sellouts, we're now only getting about 800 to 900 people at a game at a time. So crowds really diminished quickly for these games. The Indiana-Michigan League disbanded in 1950, and the Red Sox sort of became like an independent team in 51. And then they joined a new league in 1952, but that league disbanded shortly after the season began. And at that point, the writing was kind of on the wall, and the Red Sox, as a team, disbanded in July of 52. So, in conclusion, we see that the Red Sox were a strongly community-oriented team, featuring players who worked full-time jobs here and around Lafayette and then played baseball at Loeb Stadium for the team. We also see that the Negro League exhibitions that they played are really important for filling out the historical record for Negro League baseball. We get to see all those teams who came to Lafayette and all those future Hall of Famers. And I want to close with a quote from Dale Davis from a June 27th, 1958 article in the Journal and Courier. As he said, having played and coached high school and college sports, I've often marveled at the way that semi-pro baseball team would battle to win a game. They would drive in here from all distances after working most of the day and then play like their lives depended upon that very game. We see that when we go through all the different box scores, especially against the professional teams at the Red Sox, they really did play some close games against those teams, and it's really impressive. And I will now take any questions that you have.
Probably go back, but since Harry Bradway was associated with WASK, I'd look to see if he could have been announced.
Possible.
He didn't announce the games.
Well, this was great, and I really appreciated the complexity of the era of during World War II, because I would have thought with all these players, fighting in the war, that, baseball might have really.
No, that still would have gone.
That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Doesn't mean the quality of play was very good, but because the most famous story is that in 1945, the St. Louis Browns, who are now the Baltimore Orioles, they fielded Pete Gray, who was a one-armed outfielder. And so that kind of shows you just how extreme it got trying to get players to play for the major league teams during the war.
So my question is, and again, thank you for a really enlightening presentation. So why did the crowds diminish in the late 40s? Was there alternative entertainment?
I think that's what it was. I think like with the rise of TV, people were more mobile after the war. I think those kind of factors played into it, and then they just kind of lost interest in the team.
Okay, thank you.
You mentioned Evershaw early,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, we knew him.
Yeah.
Maybe other people even better than we did, but I didn't get much follow-up like you did with Spider and those people. The Evershaw's.
He was he was like an owner. He wasn't, I'm not sure how long he was even involved in the ownership group. So that's why I didn't really focus as much on him.
He had a son who played basketball. Maybe
Yeah.
baseball, I don't remember, but
Yeah, well,
definitely
that's
basketball.
not, I mean, yeah, he was a regular at the pub as well.
Yeah.
So you can get stories right there.
SCC.
Yeah, he went to CC, but then at Purdue, he played basketball and football. He was a quarterback behind Bob Greasy and Nick Phipps. And he'd only get in at the end of the game, throw a 40 or 50
Behind
yard
those
pass.
guys.
How many teams did Lafayette have in total, would you say? I mean, I've heard of like Maroons of the Farmers.
Yeah, so the Maroons and the Farmers were early 1900s.
Yeah.
Then the Red Sox teams who played at League Park, this Red Sox team, another Red Sox team, the Lafayette Leopards who played in the 90s, and then of course the Aviators now. And those are like the sanctioned teams. I mean, there was also like, company teams, neighborhood teams that played against each other too. And those are way more numerous.
I can't see the room.
You gotta help me. What does it mean when a player was released?
Means that they were let go. They were.
So like the owners
It's a
said,
nice way of saying you're fired.
thank you, that's what I wanted
He
to write down.
could have been hurt,
Yeah.
Okay,
or
thank you,
maybe his skills weren't good enough to
Yes.
play with the other guys.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
My brother played